What is the impact of healings in the medical community when you have these healings and you're in hospitals? How do they respond when you tell them that you're healing through prayer?
Well, first of all, nurses, where I was there, asked whether I was Christian. And they almost try to look for a person to heal. And so I really had to turn their attention to God. The God is for everyone, and God heals. And some of the doctors has come to me and said, if I could come and speak to the doctors, and this had also happened in Singapore, but I had this member who was healed speak to the doctors. And these are the cancer specialists, and some of them were interns, and they wanted to hear how Christian Science works. And so there's a great deal of interest in Christian Science, or the way we feel that the prayer is effective medicine, because they know the limit of what they can do. So from my experience in Japan, Korea, and Singapore, in India, the reason I was speaking to the nurses in India is because one of the doctors who teach at that school had witnessed healing by his son and son's wife who go to Christian Science church services. So I think, to me, if you're a real scientist as a doctor, they are open to these ideas.
Should I just add something? I'm a member of the Foundational Questions in Physics, and it's basically by invitation only, and it's an institute for theoretical physicists. And I was at one of the meetings in Canada, and this physician, this PhD, MD, well, basically, he had said some interesting things, and I said, so we should have lunch. And he said, okay, but let me tell you from the start, the brain doesn't think, so don't bother me about that. I'm going, I'll buy. So there is unfoldment happening in that community, and it's partly based on the idea that electrons produce consciousness in the brain synapses, but physicists have already discovered that electrons don't exist until they're measured by consciousness. So it's not possible that something that's created by a measurement or an observation or an observer could produce the consciousness of the observer, which is required to precede the particle called an electron. So it's like everybody's playing catch-up. But it took the whole 20th century for everybody to catch up to Mrs. Eddy.
True.
They say that most millennials have not or do not believe in God, and I just wondered, for Dr. Doyle or both of you, how do we reach the millennials today with scientific thinking of Christian Science?
Yeah, I've had a Sunday school person that teaches Sunday school told me that she teaches college level, that the college student said, well, that's very interesting and theoretical, and it's nice to think of harmony and all, but it doesn't have any practical application, does it? Christian Science is impractical. I'm going, well, there's never been an answer to any problem that doesn't involve an idea. As a matter of fact, an idea is all you need. If you look at the problem solved in history, it's taken an idea. So what if you could go to a source that had the right ideas that would solve all problems, and you knew how to access that? I would call that relevant.
Well, I think when people leave so-called religious institution, there's a reason. And I think because I was a skeptic coming into studying Christian Science, I just know that it has to be felt. And it's not by rules or categorizing people. And also, if we don't emphasize the science part of Christian Science, we will lose them because they're much sharper ahead of our, more, I guess, we have to give them more credit for thinking ahead, but they're also the community of not wanting to separate people. So if we feel somehow we have something more than others, then we're already in the wrong mindset. That if they're already in what we all have, we don't have anything more to teach, but to recognize, just as the instructor had healing of the cancer in pancreas. I was told earlier, you cannot share that healing because it's not Christian Science. In the lecture. But I know that I had to insist that if this is science, it's universal. But a child can heal, can be a witness to healing. It's not a child is healing, but we are all witnessing. As you said, Jesus came to witness.
Should I just throw in a quick story? The universality sometimes of the truth shows up and I had a Native American friend, and he said missionaries came out to the reservation and built a church. And afterward they went to the Indians and they said, this church is sacred. And the Indians said, you can't fool us, we saw you building it. That valley is sacred, that rock is sacred, that mountain is sacred, but you guys built the church. A little more universal is in order.
So true.
To Dr. Doyle, but to both of you, actually. Mrs. Eddy has a statement in Science and Health, I believe it's, God forms and peoples the universe. I believe that's correct. It doesn't say forms and peoples reality, or forms and peoples the earth, or forms and peoples Los Angeles. Forms and peoples the universe. Your job is looking for extraterrestrial life. We hear, and for so long now, UFOs, aliens, the grays, all of this. Any insights that you have on that phenomena?
Well, I mentioned looking for chalk in the universe as a way of detecting math. And there is still a looking at organic molecules in the universe as a way of detecting life. But there's a growing unfoldment in the astrobiology community that to not restrict the principle that's expressing itself to the form of its expression, especially if it's an infinite principle can't be expressed in a finite form. So that Mrs. Eddy says God forms and peoples, in particular, the universe. And she says that man is, represents all of creation. She says that that animals express the same intelligence. And she says that they are harmless, useful, and indestructible. In other words, non-humans are harmless, useful, and indestructible. And a knowledge of that, if you keep reading in Science and Health, a knowledge that animals, non-humans, are, indestructible and express God the same as we do. She says that will make you a better healer and a better follower of Christ Jesus. Isn't that very Native American to say? So the fact that she says God forms and peoples the universe makes total sense in the idea that life itself, the universe is in life. We're not looking for life in the universe. I always reverse that when people say, oh, you understand you're looking for life in the universe. And I always say to myself, no, the universe is in life. And so we should, once you have the basis of life, then everything's alive. And you're going, well, wait a second. Are you saying that a rock is alive? Mrs. Eddy says that if you look at a stone materially, you'll see matter. But if you look at it spiritually, it disappears in its material form and reappears as an idea in infinite mind. So what if everything's alive and nothing's dead? See, the model in the SETI community and the astrobiology community in general is that the universe is mostly dead matter. And that occasionally you can make matter so complex that it reverses its nature altogether and becomes alive. Nothing else works like that. Why we say that about matter, I don't know. But you can't make something, I make so many mistakes that I suddenly got the right answer. It's like nothing else works that way. So The Christian Science model of the universe is so much more open. It says there's infinite life that is expressing itself in the ideas of life, expression. And so Christian Science rightly cannot think of the universe as mostly dead. They have to think of it as all life. Everything is alive. Well, if matter is not alive and life is everywhere, then there is no matter. That's the model of the universe Christian Science puts forth, and that's what happens when you, it makes more sense. It's more consistent. And so I just think that we have to reverse that particular thing. Sometimes you have to reverse stuff, and sometimes you have to affirm it. But, to me, I've often thought they haven't gone far enough. Instead of like, those scientists have gone too far. No. You'll find in every case they haven't gone far enough. Keep going, and you'll see Mrs. Eddy sitting there going, well, it's about time.
Thank you both so much. I just appreciate it. I do just fine swimming in the ocean of love until I watch the news and I see the fires and the earthquakes and the innocent children caught in crossfires. And just how do you approach those things in general?
Well, the reason we are still studying this subject, we might call it Christianity or Christian Science, is because we have not really accomplished what Jesus promised us, which is you will know the truth and the truth shall make you free. And if we are seeing ourselves somehow compartmentalizing and dividing ourselves and seeing other than, not really feeling that oneness, Jesus asked us to call no one Father but the one which is in heaven. That makes us all brothers and sisters. And I think we're in the process. We're not saying that we have already brought the heaven on earth, but we are in the process of doing this. And our job is to see whether our prayer can really align not only ours, but through that Christ is speaking to every human consciousness, that we can move people. We move people to less matter, which is really, it seems like kind of a superficial element, but the more matter we are drawn to, more restriction and fear we are going to invite. So I was just recently thinking, what's the biggest matter that we produce on our earth?
Trash.
Plastic. No. The biggest matter that we produce is weapon. We don't see it in the market, so we don't think about this. But think about if Jesus was called the Prince of Peace, and if we have not really understood his teachings, no wonder we're still building some matter to bring peace about. The peace must be available at our fingertips if we understand the principles of teachings, that he asked us to really think about. The Lord's Prayer, give us this day our daily bread. It's about this day, give us. Who are us? The entire human race? Have we really fed everyone, even for one day? No. I think we have to really face this reality and say, yes, we have the spiritual reality, but there seems to be a discrepancy that we need to really come together and seek help from the higher intelligence, the divine mind. Because the more we understand the principle we need less matter. I'm staying with a family whose grandfather had something to do with invention of a gramophone. You know how huge the how do you call this part? The horn. And have a place to crank. And that's only two generations ago. And how do we listen to music nowadays? MP3 or, just have a little thing in your ear. I mean, the reason we have less matter, even just the way we listen to music, is because we understood the principle. The more we understand the principles, we're going to make less matter, including trash. The environment will improve, but also we will get along better. So there's something more we should be really thinking and think, what can I really give, but also to give up? So that's my...
The reason,
Thank you.
The reason we call it demonstration in Christian Science, when I do a demonstration in front of a chemistry class, I do an experiment. I know what the result's going to be because I've already done, the experiment's already been done. I recreate an experimental verification for the instruction of the class. Well, Jesus did all the experiments. There isn't one experiment. Somebody said, Jesus is coming back, and before I could stop my mouth, I said, what do you want him to do this time? He did it all. And so we do demonstrations of his experimental verification of reality. And if we haven't achieved that yet, jump into Jesus' life again. And again, every time you see some apparent evil succeeding or vying for reality, you know that Jesus already overcame that. And, I tell people, do you believe mathematics is material? I go, no. And then they see me reach for a calculator or a piece of chalk. I go, aha, you do believe it's material. It is not inconsistent to use a calculator and still not buy into the idea that math is in the calculator. Okay, it's a temporary and eternal means. I did my master's thesis on IBM 1130. And I used cards. And I was shocked to go to the Computer Science Museum in San Jose in Mountain View. And it said it was 8K of memory. 8K of memory? And it's, it's about, 2 or 3 rows worth of computer. And I pulled this out, which is 64 gigs. 8 million times the memory of this thing. And I thought, well, it's not the material. This is silicon dioxide. This is sand with daubs of gold and some rare earth elements. But the IBM 1130 is, it's sand with daubs of gold and some rare earth elements. So it's the same stuff even. What's the difference? More understanding, less matter. In spades, if I wanted this much memory stored in IBM 1130s, I'd have to have 40 square miles of IBM 1130s. So, less matter with more understanding. That's the only explanation.
And I don't even know how to put it into words because it was something you said, I heard previously, Dr. Doyle, but it was the idea of healing the past. And it had to do with the observer. If the observer is God, and you had talked about how you had done an experiment with rays. Could you repeat that again so maybe I could remember it this time?
Yeah, basically there's something called the double slit experiment, and it's where you start explaining from a quantum physics viewpoint to people how things are not as they appear. And for example, if you shine a laser light through 2 holes, what builds up is an interference pattern. What that means is, if you're in a swimming pool and you move back and forth, you make a wall of water on the opposite side, a little peak of water. If your friend goes, that looks like fun, and jump in, and they both start to move, then you don't get 2 peaks of water. You get their waves interfering with your waves, and you get an interference pattern. So what does this mean? When you shine light through 2 holes and you get an interference pattern, it means light's a wave. Well, it's kind of odd to see 1 pixel light up at a time when you stop the laser down so it emits 1 particle at a time. So you're allowing 1 particle at a time. You would expect 2 dots. Either it went through this hole or this hole. Instead, what builds up when you come back in the morning is an interference pattern. That means that each particle of light did not exist as a particle until it hit the detector, because it went through both holes. So it gets better. You look at this hole, you go, this is really tricky. I'm going to see which hole it goes through. the interference pattern goes away just looking. You haven't touched the laser, you haven't touched the particle, you haven't touched the detector. All you did is get knowledge of which path, and the particles go, I'm out of here. And they don't make an interference pattern. So that means that the particle doesn't exist as a particle. You can do this with electrons, and that's what I was talking about earlier with the brain. There is no such thing as an unmeasured electron is not a particle. And you can do this, I've done this at the print optics lab. So it gets better. You say, okay, well, what if I don't look now? What if I look way down range here next to the detector with a telescope? And what I'll do is the light goes through the two holes, and it's, of course, going to interfere because it's not being measured. And then I look at the last minute before it hits the detector. What you get is two spots. It's like you backloaded the past so that nothing exists until it's measured, and it doesn't matter if it supposedly happened in the past. Well, now I want to do an experiment where that's a quasar 7 billion light years away, and this is a galaxy, and I have two paths, and I make an interference pattern, and then I want to change what I can know, and what's going to happen. I know what's going to happen, but it's going to be weird to usual science, is the minute I change and look at it so I can tell which path, even though the light's traveled for 7 billion years, it's not going to go both paths, it's going to go one or the other. So I will have changed what supposedly trip it made over 7 billion years ago. Mm-hmm. So that's called quantum astronomy, and I'm working on the paper now. But how can you explain that? Knowing changes the result without infinite mind, and without now being the only reality. At SETI we say stay tuned, so I would say stay tuned.
There's an interesting fact that when I used to give a lecture on the Lord's Prayer, I looked up the word the closet, go into thine closet. And that word closet is related to the word now. You go into the now, the present.
Wow.
And then no wonder, everything that he says after is about now and not later. It's give us this day our daily bread. It's not about next week or your retirement. You know, and then also whether it's a forgiveness or not, it's about now. It's not about the past. So in a way, he already understood when he said, before Abraham was, I am.
Yeah.
It's just no sense of time separating us from each other. And my take on the creation of man is that if God is infinite, he only had to say once, let there be light, right? Not like many lights, or that white light. Because God is not a manufacturer. When we were created, he only had to say once, let there be man. And there's man. Infinite ideas come out of it. And when you think about flowers, if there's one idea called flowers, because God is infinite, we have infinite expressions of flowers. No two flowers are alike, right? I don't know, I've never seen, read anywhere that exactly the same flowers, even the blade of grass. That infinite, I think we need to really understand because we limit ourselves too much. I come from my human parents, and then we have these inheritances, whether it's good or bad. We have much better inheritance when we know that we are always now with God, and God had to only say once, let there be man.
In Genesis, do you ever notice in the first chapter, God creates by letting, and in the second by forming? And that letting is allowing. So it's not even a beginning. Forming breaks the second commandment, making an image and likeness of God. That's graven. And also, I just want to throw out real quick, I was trying to think of what now means, and I realized that, has anybody ever said to you, like, have you ever been there? Well, I never have, because every time I go there, it turns to here by the time I get there. So you can't get there from here, and I've never been there. And it's the same thing with God. There's only now. Have you ever been then? Never. By the time I get there, it's now.
Also, I haven't really found anyway, but I can ask if there's a linguist here, and I've been doing some research, the relationship between now and new.
And new.
Because everything now is new. There's nothing past. That's why we want to live in the new.
We live in the new. I like it.
I heard you a few years ago, and you shared a wonderful experience with a dog. I guess it was in Pasadena or La Crescenta or something like that. And I think it's worth sharing again if you'd be willing to do that.
Yeah, there was this little dog. Well, I walked out from my apartment, and there were two neighbor ladies who I knew, and their little white poodle. Is this the one? Yeah. And so I just knelt down. They were talking. I said, hi. Well, how are you? And I petted the little dog. Aren't you a sweetie? And all. And the dog, when I finished petting and stood up, the dog went zoom, as dogs do, down about halfway down the block, and then veering past. And then veering came up and jumped up on me. And I looked up, and the two ladies had their mouths open. They're like, what did you say? I just said, nice dog and all. And they said that the dog had been sick for 3 days and had to be lifted out of the car. So it was an impersonal treatment. And I didn't treat for sick dog at all. You are a beautiful, wonderful, little, petable, So, instantaneous healing. And they said, what did you do? And I go, I just saw the dog as expressing God. I just left it at that, but they know I was a Christian Scientist. They're neighbors.
Are quantum physicists becoming aware of Christian Science or accepting it?
Can I also add to that as his son? Also, you've previously talked in the same line of thinking about how consciousness is like a wave rather than a particle. Could you integrate that in your answer?
Yeah,
Thanks.
that's what at this Foundational Questions in Physics meeting, they were asking for, what is your view of reality, and doing a poll. We got it down to about 7. And they got to me, and I couldn't say all is infinite mind and its infinite manifestation, for God is all in all. But I could say that consciousness is a field, not a particle. And that's a physics version of that. A field means everywhere, like gravity field. And a particle means it isn't limited, like an electron. So they put that up, people voted for it, so they're well aware. If you put it in the right lingo, what Christian Science is. What they don't believe is, when I read from No and Yes, I've read them this, and I've included it in talks. Mrs. Eddy writes, the material atom is an outline falsity of consciousness. And I go, that's from the 19th century. And they go, no way. So that's where I run into trouble. Not that Mrs. Eddy's view of reality is being converged upon, but that she came up with it 125 years ago is very hard for them to buy. But fortunately, I have some credibility in the scientific and the physics community. So it's like, we can't entirely discount this as a crackpot. So, and the thing is, even the past 10 years, things have converged in a more metaphysical Mrs. Eddy direction. I mean, don't you feel like
Yes.
a lot of religion is like, Joe Ritter, he just left Principia, but he is a dean of faculty and a chemistry professor. And he used to be Catholic before he found Christian Science. And he pulled out the old catechism and showed me 3 places where they've revised things to talk about infinite mind. It's like, what? So I'm sure I'm not the only one whose field is unfolding in a metaphysical direction that Mrs. Eddy already pioneered.
And the fact that we have in this textbook the chapter on the science, medicine, and theology, It means that we all need to see that Christian Science has an effect, as a leaven effect in all these fields. It's coming up and changing. And I feel that in science especially, sometimes seems in religion, theology might be the most stubborn field. But I think those who are willing to open up and to discover, to take the cover off, people have been more open to it.
Yeah, I think Mrs. Eddy was almost immediately recognized as a revolutionary in theology. And during the 20th century, if anybody's paying attention to medicine, they would have recognized she got there first. But it really takes it's the 21st century that will start to recognize her as a scientist that got there first. So I think Mrs. Eddy in the list with Newton and Einstein and so on is something that's coming, but it just took a century to catch up, for the natural science community to catch up.
Can you address the idea, the spiritual implications of the idea that the universe goes on forever?
Well, Mrs. Eddy said that the universe, there was no beginning. And the Big Bang seemed to imply a beginning, which some church people love that idea. But the current theory is that if it's called the inflationary universe, and in a nutshell, it basically said the whole universe started at infinitesimally small and with quantum fluctuations due to the uncertainty principle, and then it expanded, inflated to 10 to the 30th light years. So the universe we see is 13.8 billion years old, but the only reason we don't see stars everywhere is because the light hasn't had time to reach us yet. And the inflationary universe predicts the microwave background will have quantum fluctuation distribution, and it does. The thing with quantum fluctuation with the inflationary universe is ours can't be the first one. It requires at least two other universes called branes, B-R-A-N-E-S, but that's another subject, to collide and cause our Big Bang, and our Big Bang caused others. So there is no beginning in the current, looks like it's correct cosmology, which I feel much more comfortable with infinity. Oh, somebody requested before that we count, Eric, my brother, requested that we count to the infinite. I think everybody knows how to do this, don't you? Do you want to count to infinity? Okay, ready? Let's do it together. 1. No, just 1. There's only one infinite.
There is a concept also of coming out from among the material world and being separate. So there seems to be a juxtaposition there between the oneness and yet coming out from. Can you elaborate on that?
Okay. We have to decide if we're caretakers of a religious tradition or prophets of spiritual reality. And that's, the truth will protect us. And, the truth will stand by us. But we also have to be open to sharing it. I look on, what if somebody looks back on us and say, you had a cure for starvation? You had a cure for every disease? You had a cure for war? And you kept it a secret? So we should not be afraid to keep it a secret. The truth will protect us, and it protect itself. And we do have to, I think church channels are great. And I think that Jesus, he didn't have to teach, but he went out and taught. And I don't think he was discreet, don't cast your pearls before swine, but he wasn't afraid to speak the truth to the Pharisees or speak the truth to a withered hand or speak the truth to a troubled sea. So I think we need to think of ourselves as prophets of the science of being and spend a little less time being caretakers. It just struck me that, we don't hide. How can I, as a science and scientific community, get up and talk about Christianity as I do? My colleagues go, he's a scientist.
look at the papers and stuff. I mean, I'm okay with that. So it causes them to think about, could Jesus have been a scientist, really? It's like, yeah.
Well, in a textbook, Mrs. Eddy gives a definition of church. Many of you are probably familiar with the structure of truth and love. And if we know we are the first structure of truth and love that make up that church, it's not that there's a church and we go inside and affirming that the structure is truth and love. We ourselves have to be structure of truth and love. And I think the church, the concept of church is really for public. And for public to see, it's important to see that we represent ourselves in the structure of that church. Does it really represent the truth and love? And I think that's, no matter what form it takes, it might be 2 people, 3 people, 100 people. I don't think Mrs. Eddy was impressed by big churches, even at her time. She warned a lot of time not to be impressed by the podium, the size of the edifice. Even to her own church that she had followers build, only visited a couple of times. So when people were not around. So I think it's really important to not put church in front and hide behind it, but just be that I am the structure of truth and love. And here's church that you can really be part of.
One more question? One more question?
Thank you both very much. I just wanted to say that you both complement each other really well. I really appreciated that.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you.
And Dr. Doyle, when you were speaking earlier, you had said in your talk, when people ask you what Christian Science is, and you had two statements, 2 phrases, I think. Could you repeat that again?
Well, what I usually say is all is infinite mind and its expression, and that's the description of the universe, and that the healing process that Christian Science does is to heal with reality, because reality is perfect. So Mrs. Eddy what did Mrs. Eddy discover? She discovered reality is perfect. That's a huge breakthrough and a complete rebuke to the material sense evidence.
And in light of what you were just saying about going out and telling people about Christian Science, sometimes I find it a little difficult then when I do talk about the perfection of reality, when people say, well, how can you account for all this suffering? And I think that's something that we all encounter when we try to talk to people about Christian Science. And I was wondering if you could just give both of you just a little enlightenment on what we could be saying to people in a nutshell. I know it's hard in a nutshell, but something.
Oh, it's okay. I can do it in a nutshell. I'm good with nutshells. There's 3 choices. God is all powerful but good and bad. God is only good, but bad is also a power, so God's not all powerful. Or God is all powerful, good, and anything else that testifies to anything else is bad data. Christian Science says the material sense evidence is not reliable. And natural science in general is concluding that all the way up to quantum physics so far. So we have to remind ourselves that the principle of mathematics, no number has ever gotten out of line or made a mistake, ever. And you start with that premise when you go to solve a problem. And that's exactly how Christian Science starts. Perfect God and perfect man is the basis of thought and demonstration. So we start with perfection. And we don't allow the evidence of the material senses to testify otherwise. When you look at the chalk, that's the only place where a mistake can be made in mathematics, is in the chalk, because it's never made in math. So once you recognize the chalk really doesn't have any say, you quit believing it, and you're healed.
Very helpful, thank you.